Okay, ladies, I'm doing this screencast today for you because unfortunately I can't be at school with you this morning. But I'm going to give you some notes, and I'd like you to write these down in your notebook. I will also be sending you this and/or putting it on Drive. So you will have this one way or the other, but I would like you to try to take some notes today while I give you this presentation. We're going to start off talking about community relationships, and we're going to start off with a concept map. And in that concept map, I'm going to sort of define some terms that you need to know. Also, and try to provide you some examples. Also, you should have some of these things in your notes. And if you'd like to, you can either take notes fresh today, or you can add on to what you have already from your reading. So let's start off by talking about the four main types of community relationships. The first that I'm going to talk about is called herbivory. And herbivory is really about grazers and being an herbivore. Okay, for example, goats on an alpine mountain. They eat the grass and the lichen and all that kind of stuff. They are grazers. That is an example of herbivory. Okay. The next thing we're going to talk about are predator-prey relationships. Okay. Predator-prey, unlike herbivory, is when you get an animal that hunts, kills, and eats another animal. So here we're not talking about vegetarians like you are in herbivory. We're now talking about carnivores and omnivores. Okay, the next group that I wanted to talk about was competition. Okay, there are two main types of competition. Interspecific and intraspecific. Okay, intra and inter. Interspecific stands for competition between two different species, and intraspecific is within the same species. Now, let's think about some things that species might compete for. What are some things that species might compete for? Try to make a list on your paper of some things that two separate species might compete for, or different animals within the same, or different animals or plants within the same species might compete for. Okay, you should be saying some things like food. You might say things like space. Okay? You might say light. Think of plants too. Not everything is an animal. You might say shelter. And if you were talking about an intraspecific competition, you might also mention mates. Okay? So these are just some of the things that that organisms might compete for. Lastly, in a different type of relationship, we're going to talk about symbiotic relationships. And there are three main types of symbiotic relationships. The first one we're going to talk about is a mutualistic relationship. Let's squeeze that in there. Mutualistic relationships are when two species benefit by being in a close relationship with each other. The next is a commensalistic relationship. And in commensalism, one species benefits while the other is neither helped nor harmed. And then lastly are the parasitic relationships. And these you're probably pretty familiar with, but one is helped and the other is harmed. Okay, let's talk about these symbiotic relationships. to sort of tease out what that actually means. Symbiotic relationships are very, very close relationships. Sometimes these relationships are so close that one species cannot live without the other. Okay? So for instance, what is not a symbiotic relationship is a random bird and a random tree, because the bird builds its nest in the tree. That is not a symbiotic relationship. Can you tell me why that is not a symbiotic relationship? Think about it. Okay, it is not a symbiotic relationship because that bird could build its nest on the roof of your garage. Okay? It is not a specific enough relationship. However, there is an example of a mutualistic relationship with ants and the tree called the acacia tree. In this relationship, this is a mutualistic relationship, the tree provides nectar in these special pouches called nectaries. It also provides hollow thorns for the ants to live in because they can't live in the soil because it's too dry. Meanwhile, the ants provide the tree with defense. They will go after any grazer that comes near that tree. They will attack it and sting it. This relationship has evolved over thousands of years, and it is a mutualistic symbiotic relationship, a very, very close relationship. Without the nectaries, those ants would not survive, and without the ants, those trees would not survive. They'd be chewed up, okay, by those giraffes in the savannah. All right, so that's an example of a very, very close relationship. Another example of a parasitic relationship might actually be viruses and humans. That is an example of a parasitic relationship. So I hope you get some ideas about how close of a relationship these symbiotic relationships are. Okay, so just to summarize, we have herbivory, we have predator-prey, we have competition, and we have symbiosis. Okay? So those are the four main types of community relationships that ecologists study. All right, your book mentioned something called the competitive exclusion principle. And the competitive exclusion principle has to do a lot with populations. And so we are going to sort of define some terms of a population. A population, if you remember from our biological hierarchy, is the same species living in a community. And when we study populations, we're really studying the number of those organisms within that community. But we're only talking about one particular species when we talk about a population. Now, you can study the population of birds of paradise, right? There are lots of different species, but when you talk about populations, you're talking about each species individually. And that's how we study populations. So the competitive exclusion principle, let's first talk about, let's graph this a little bit. We're going to talk about time on the bottom, and we're going to talk about population numbers on the y-axis. So let's define a few terms. First off, if you've got a species and you put it in a situation where it's got an abundance of food, you are going to see a growth that might look something like this. Okay? This is called exponential growth. And I know that you've talked about this in math. Exponential growth, right about here. Yeah? From about here to here. Exponential growth is when the population is growing with really no limits. There's no limit to that exponential growth. This is also sometimes called a J curve. Okay? Because it sort of looks like a J. But if we were allowing time to move on, and those resources eventually become depleted, what might you see? You might see a leveling off of that population. When the graph looks like this, it is called an S-curve. And what has happened is that that population has reached what we call a carrying capacity. Okay, the carrying capacity, and you should write this down, the carrying capacity is the maximum number of organisms that a community can hold. Okay, the maximum number of organisms that a community can hold. It's the max. So it's this value right here that is the carrying capacity. Okay, the maximum value. All right, so now that we've talked about carrying capacity, exponential growth, and the types of curves, now let's sort of talk about what might happen to a population or two populations that are competing for a resource. Remember what happened up here with this imaginary species, okay? It reached its carrying capacity. Now let's say that we have a test tube. And in this test tube, we've got two species of paramecium. You saw paramecium in your bio bottles. It is a protist. It lives in fresh water. Kind of looks like this. All right? I know, it's weird. But it's a little guy that zooms around in freshwater ponds. And we've got species A and species B. These paramecium, they love to eat bacteria. Love bacteria. Okay? That is their food of choice. Now let's say we put those two species together in a tube filled with some bacteria. All right? And you've got two different species, species A and species B. And we were to look at time, and we were to look at numbers. Okay? And let's change some colors here. And let's make species A green. All right? And let's make species B red, or pink, because that's what came up. Okay. All right, so what we might see is something that looks like this. Okay, so that's species B, and this is species A. All right, what do you see happening? What's going on here? All right, what you should be noticing is that species B, its populations drastically declined, right? Almost to the point of extinction, all right? Extinction. And species A acted like normal, no problems, okay? Its species numbers went up, no big deal, just like normal. Well, this competitive exclusion principle says that two species, okay, that occupy the same niche this is why we went over that word, okay, so important, that occupy the same niche, in other words, that they eat that same bacteria, only one will win. Okay? The other has two choices, extinction, or it can do something called resource partitioning. And your book talked about this idea with sparrows in the tree. This idea that it changes its niche. It adapts to the competition by changing its niche. Okay? to avoid, extinction, basically. And so this is the idea of the competitive exclusion